Hello and welcome to P Guru's channel. I'm your host Sri Iyer. Today I have the pleasure of company of Sri Sanjay Dikshit. Sanjay Di, welcome to P Guru's channel.
Namaste. How are you?
I'm doing well, sir, and thanks for taking time out from your busy schedule to join this hangout. A couple of things, viewers. What are we going to expect from this conversation? The first one is that Sanjay ji is going to explain a little bit about what happened with Bakhtiyar Khilji, his the truths and untruths that were shared in a conversation between Javed Akhtar and Tariq Fateh. There's a lot of stuff that has happened after that, where Fateh Saab had come on a couple of other programs and explained how he was, never given a chance to even put out his point of view. And Javed Akhtar ji, who took 47 minutes out of the total conversation, kept complaining that he wasn't getting enough time. It was only an hour-long program. So there was some interesting stuff that happened. Now, Sanjay ji, you yourself had a monologue about this conversation, and we are trying to take a next step and try to unravel it for all our non-Hindi speaking understanding listeners and viewers. So Sanjay ji, maybe you can summarize what you said in your Hindi hangout, and then afterwards I have a few follow-up questions that we can take it from there on.
That Hindi hangout was actually some kind of a broadside on Javed Akhtar. Because what he was doing was, in that conversation with Tariq Fateh, he was getting all personal. And he was questioning Tariq Fateh's pedigree, where all he went, what he was doing in Saudi Arabia, what he did in Canada, what was his politics. Everything except the issue. So because he was questioning his pedigree, because he was questioning his antecedents and everything else, his locus, so I thought that because a lot of people think that Javed Akhtar is a real atheist, or he's a real secular, or is a real something. And I know, because I stay very close to the place where his ancestors come from. Khairabad is actually Javed Akhtar Khairabadi. Khairabad is a place about 80 kilometers from Lucknow, and very near the district town of Sitapur.
And he's the son of Jan Nisar Akhtar, right?
He is son of Jan. I'll come to that.
Okay,
Very,
go ahead.
very detailed, very enjoyable exercise. I think all of us will enjoy that.
Yes.
Jan Nisar Akhtar is his father, then is Muntazar Ali, or that's his grandfather. Then his great grandfather, Mr. Abdul Haq. Mr. Abdul Haq was a contemporary of Ahmad Raza Barelvi, and his father of his great grandfather was Maulana Fazle Haq Khairabadi. Maulana Fazle Haq Khairabadi has a great name among the Muslim clerics, and he actually acted as a bridge between those two particular streams, what is called the Devbandi and the Barelvi. I think we will get into more details when we come to that.
Yes.
But the kind of pedigree he holds, Maulana Fazle Haq Khairabadi was a jihadi, in the sense that he was working in the employ of the Raja of Alwar at that time. And when this 1857 thing started, then he quickly seized the opportunity, went to Delhi, and because of his pedigree and because he had studied under Shah Abdul Aziz, the son of Shah Waliullah. I don't know whether our audience would recognize Shah Waliullah, but Shah Waliullah was the son of the person who headed the editorial board, Shah Abdul Rahim, editorial board of Fatwa-e Alamgiri.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Fatwa-e Alamgiri. What is Fatwa-e Alamgiri? Was that great collection of fatwas got compiled at the behest of Aurangzeb. And then who was the mentor of Aurangzeb? Aurangzeb's mentor was Sheikh Saifuddin, who was the grandson of Ahmad Sarindi, of whom I think we had a powwow with Javed Akhtar a little earlier on a Twitter battle. And who is Sheikh Sarindi? He derives his pedigree from the Faruqi clan. What is the Faruqi clan? Faruqi clan claims, a lot of it is all claims. There's claims to go back right to Hazrat Umar. Hazrat Umar was the third caliph. Sorry, the second caliph. The out of the four, what is called the right guided caliphs or the Rashidun caliphs, he was the second one. First one was Hazrat Abu Bakr, then Hazrat Umar, then Hazrat Usman, and then Hazrat Ali. These are the four Rashidun caliphs. So that is the kind of pedigree he claims, and still he feels shy, and he says that he's become an atheist and a fake atheist at that. When he has to marry a second time, then he goes ahead and marries Shabana Azmi without divorcing Hani Irani. But otherwise, he's an atheist. Claims he's an atheist. Claims that he raised his son and daughter from his first marriage, Hani Irani, as atheists. So, I mean, it's all what is called jalebi in pure Hindi. It's all Javed Akhtar's jalebi, which we need to, you take it out bit by bit and show it to him and explain to him, look, Javed ji, we know a lot. We know a lot about you. We know a lot about your pedigree. We also know about the fake claims that you make. Even, he made a claim that in the 1950s, he went to Bombay and he lived on a footpath with some 10 paisa or 6 paisa. Of course, there was a dispute between his Begum Shabana, and himself on the amount of money that he had. The whole point was that his father was a well-established name in Bollywood.
That's why I asked you that question. That is the son of Jan Nisar Akhtar.
He studied in the most prestigious school of Lucknow, Colvin Talukdar College. And at that time, that when he was there in that school, Colvin Talukdars, at that time, only sons of the Talukdars and sons of the Jamindars, the great Nawabs and such people could get admission there. And then he says that no, that and he was also he studied in Bhopal, went to Aligarh, all that he did. But when he landed in Bombay, he had only a few pennies in his pocket, and he went to a footpath in spite of his father having a fairly well-appointed house in Bombay. So I think the man is a fake, and the man claims a lot, and his basic integrity and his basic sense of history are all under question.
Well, I guess we liked Javed Akhtar, the lyricist, perhaps even the dialogues, and it's this new avatar that is causing all this conflicts, and perhaps he was. He should have stayed with Moviedom, and he could have rode into the sunset with that, his reputation intact. But that's, we're not only is Mr. Akhtar doing this, but I'm deep south in Tamil Nadu. We have Kamal Haasan, who's doing something very similar. And frankly, nobody understands. Perhaps even he doesn't understand what he says. So there is a.
You have Kamal Haasan. You also have T.M. Krishna. So you have all takes around.
Yes. So now back to Bakhtiyar Khilji. Couple of things that he mentioned in that talk, that Alauddin Khilji never visited Nizamuddin. That's one thing that a lot of people have refuted on social media. What are your thoughts on that?
Nizamuddin?
Yes. Khwaja Nizamuddin Chishti, the Nizamuddin Dargah in New Delhi.
He never visited Nizamuddin. It's the other way around. Why would he visit Nizamuddin? It's the Sufi saints who used to visit.
I think he was trying to establish secular credentials of Alauddin Khilji.
That's nonsense. They don't even know how Sufis used to behave. I think either he doesn't know or he's faking. His own great grandfather was a Sufi.
Right.
Supposedly Sufi, acted as a Sufi. So I definitely would say that he would definitely have known what Sufis did.
Right.
There is something about the Sufism also. You see, what is happening is that there is a lot of misconception about Sufis being greatly peaceful, and they go away from the traditional Islam. It's nothing of that kind, because there's one line that's very clear, And that also comes from history again. If people have studied the Islamic history, they would know that there was indeed what is called a reformist strain within Islam. But that was a long while back. That was in the last millennia, the last Christian millennia. And that was what is called the Mutazalli versus Asharite conflict.
Yeah, we
And
discussed this in a previous hangout of ours. Yeah, yes.
during
Please
the
continue. Yeah.
golden age of Islam, when Harun al-Rashid and al-Mamun ruled, at that time, the interpretation of Quran was very different. They interpreted it as having the concept of immanence of divine. Later on, when the power changed and the Asharites gained power, they got into the power structure. They persecuted these Mutazallis. And there was also another third strain that was called Taqiqis, those people who said, I am the truth. Mansur Halaj, who was beheaded for saying Ana Haq. You must have heard about the term Ana Haq.
Right.
So this very interesting dispute took place in which there were three strains. There was one the spiritual, then the devotional, and the third was the conservative. And the devotional and conservative, they got together and they completely squashed up the spiritual strain. The spiritual strain shifted to Spain. But even in Spain, it could not survive because the combined might of these two, the devotionals and the conservatives, was too much. Sufi al-Ghazali was ultimately supported by the conservative Ibn Taymiyyah. So in Islam, there was no way that the combined might of al-Ghazali and Ibn Taymiyyah, anybody else could survive. And that's why you have people like Avicenna and Averroes. They were completely killed off. I mean, their line was killed off. They were not physically eliminated, but that particular line of thinking was finished. And that's where what we call that dark age of Islam started. There's a funny incident that is often recited that Averroes actually made fun of Al-Ghazali. He's known as Ibn Rushd in Arabic. So Ibn Rushd made fun of Al-Ghazali, and Al-Ghazali had written a compendium. It was called, he made fun of the philosophers. He used to be called philosopher. So he said he wrote a compendium called Tahaffuz al-Falsafa, the confusion of the philosophers, the confusion of philosophy. Then Ibn Rushd wrote something called Tahaffuz al-Tahaffuz, the confusion of confusion. So that was a take on Al-Ghazali. So the entire Muslim world became so incensed with him that towards the end of his years, he used to be stationed in front of the main mosque of Cordoba in Spain, Andalusia, Al-Andalus, as the Arabs would call it.
Right.
And all the people who would walk by him would spit at him. You know, the spitting also has as a theological importance.
Fast. Yeah.
You spit to drive away the Satan.
Hmm.
So that theological weight was brought upon Ibn Rushd. They used to be spat upon. So that is the kind of thing that happened. And by the time of 13th century, that is 13th century, we're talking about, that is around the time when Nizamuddin Auliya and all are there. In 13th century, it was completely finished. So all the liberal Sufis that you hear of, they're all pre-19th century, pre-13th century. A bit of Rumi, and later on, I think the last person who was a liberal Sufi. Liberal Sufi also, what, you know, the tariqat, what is called the spiritual experience, which borders on the immanence of divine, the tariqat and shariat. Earlier, the Sufis used to claim that tariqat was a path different from shariat. But by the time Al-Ghazali and Ibn Taymiyyah worked their wonders, it was clearly established that tariqat would be subordinate to shariat. And this is what you will find in this today's two definitive Hanafi tones, I would call them. The Deoband has what is called Hidayah, and Barelvis have what is called Fatwa-i Razaviya. Ahmad Raza Barelvi's fatwas, something like 30 volumes. All that is now absolutely clear to every Islamic cleric. It is only to us that this is not clear.
Now, around the time of Alauddin Khilji, let's say before him was the Gauri, and then before that the Ghazni. Ghazni almost always invaded India to just take the loots and return. I don't think he ever tried to put down an empire, right?
You see, there's a lot of what we have as history coming from the Islamic sources. A lot of it is exaggeration.
Hmm.
For instance, Ghazni invading 17 times. That's not really confirmed by reliable sources. So, you see, Bin Qasim came in the 8th
710,
century,
711, something like that, right?
712.
Hmm.
But the Arabs could not entrench themselves. The the Indian kings were very powerful. They had, of course, been fighting the Scythians and the Huns for a long time, so they had exhausted themselves quite a lot. But even then, they were quite powerful. And Raja Dahir, of course, he made his own miscalculation. He did not really invest much into the studies of the total war doctrine that the Arabs were practicing. The war doctrines in India were very different because they would never harm the non-combatants, whereas the Arabs brought in the total war doctrine, where everything was game, and they had these pernicious practices of enslaving the population, making sex slaves, and transporting them to Arabia. That is why I laugh when these people say that the Mughals and others and they all became us. The plunderers came, threw us out of our house, put us in the outhouse, occupied that place, and because they did not leave that place, and we remained in the outhouse, so they became us. This is Shashi Tharoor. So what happened was that Arabs could not find a foothold. They were driven away beyond the Sindh. Some kind of a nominal rule was there in Multan for some time, but even that was very precarious. Later on, it was only after 3 centuries, another 3 centuries. This is a very important period which our history completely misses out.
Right. Lalitaditya rarely finds a mention in India's
Yes,
history
this
books.
was the
Right.
period in which Islam conquered the entire North Africa and a large part of Europe, and they were knocking at the door of France. And it was only in that Battle of Poitiers that their advance could be restricted or arrested. But they had occupied Spain in the 8th century. They had overrun Persia. They had overrun even the Anatolia. All this within 1 century of Islam they had done. But
How was this possible for them? Is there a superior technology they had, or just the fact that they fought for everything?
no, the total war doctrine was something new to a lot of people. This total war doctrine was, I won't say it was entirely new to Europe, but Europe had exhausted itself because of the continuous fight between the Byzantines and Sassanians. That had been going on for many centuries. And the Arabs had skillfully been playing mercenaries for both sides. Later on, what they did was that they simply decided, as it happens, you must have seen that people used to capture booths. And later on, the booth capturers decided that if they could capture booths or others, why not become MLAs themselves?
Right. Right.
So similarly, these people used to be Arabs or prize mercenaries, Arabs and Central Asian Turks. They were prize mercenaries, and their mercenary skill found them on both sides. Then they decided, under the influence of this new religion, that they could do it themselves. And both these powers were already enervated very badly, and so they fell. But this total war doctrine, this conversion business, this was something new that these parts had not seen. So they succumbed very easily. They found their first resistance in India. In India, they could not make any headway for 5 centuries. 712 to 1192 is almost 5 centuries. And in between, the Ghazni had come, but later on, he was also repulsed. You must have heard of the Battle of
Right, right,
Bahrain.
right.
In the Battle of Bahrain, his forces, his Navy, Salar Jung, uh, Ghazi Salar Jung, they were badly defeated and they were driven away and they were chased away using the same tactics because the Indians had by then learned the total war tactics and they gave them back following the Vidur Niti. And you must be knowing the Vidur Niti. So,
Perhaps for our viewers, we can touch upon it a little bit because I have some history to catch up on. But let's just talk about Vidur Niti for just a little bit. Go ahead.
the Vidur Niti it says that the shloka as it goes, it says that Krite pratikritim kuryat, Krite pratikritim kuryat. That is, to an action, have a reaction. Krite pratikritim kuryat. Hinsine pratihinsinam. To violence, have counter-violence. Nacha dosham pashyami, that I do not see any harm. Nacha dosham pashyami, shathe shakyam samacharet. I think all of us know this. Shathe shakyam samacharet, but I have given you the full shloka. So, to the rogue, be a rogue. That was practiced. That was also Chanakya, but later on, actually, for about 5 centuries, they were fighting a lot on the borders, the northwestern borders, and the people had become enervated and got quite exhausted. But even then, 1192 was the time that the Mughals could the Islamic forces could make a headway. And that is the time, I think, a lot can be said about the battle tactics of, or the war tactics of Prithviraj Chauhan also. But that was the time that the final breakthrough was made by the Islamic forces.
Yes, indeed. And how many of us remember Bappa Rawal, after whom the name, the city is named, Rawalpindi?
Yes,
and,
yes.
And somehow, again, another name that doesn't figure in our history textbooks. At least I didn't read about Bappa Rawal. All I read was Mughals, Babur Nama, Akbar Nama, Humayun Nama. I mean, this was all it was. It was full of all these things. But, it's as if India just went to sleep.
And just look at this. How many years did the Mughal Empire flourish in India?
1526 to 16, after 200 years max, I would say.
Not even 1526. In 1526, Babur was chased away.
No, I think he came to power in 1526. He came back in 1530, he was done. Only 4 years of Babur.
Only in 1556, the second battle of Panipat, that the Mughals staged a comeback.
That would be Akbar, isn't it? I mean, Humayun was out and then in and out and in. And by the time he became king, he didn't last very long after that.
1556, that the Mughal Empire got established.
And
by the turn of 1700, it was in complete disarray.
Yes.
Aurangzeb was moving all over Deccan in utter confusion. And later years, Queen Tarabai was chasing him all over the Deccan. Chased him right down to Burhanpur. In that confusion, only he died in 1707 in Ahmedabad. And all of us know that. Aurangzeb was a defeated man on the day he died. But then the Mughalophile would exalt him to be the Alamgir, the ruler of this universe. I find it quite ridiculous, actually.
Hi everyone. In the current scenario with the spread of COVID-19, the printed books are on the verge of becoming outdated, and e-books are becoming the mainstream way of reading. You can now read our ebook, Who Painted My Money White, comfortably on the Kindle app on your phone or a tab. So now, I'm going to show you how to download Kindle on your phone. Firstly, open Play Store or App Store depending upon your phone. We are following Play Store process, though the process is similar for both Android and iOS. In the search bar, type Amazon Kindle. Tap the first result to open the application page and press Install. Once installed, press Open to start the application. Use your credentials to log in. If you were already logged into an Amazon account, then you will directly reach the welcome page for the app. Tap on Start Reading and then tap on Get Started. Now in the search bar, type the book name or the author name and it will show you the relevant results. Tap on the book and then tap on Read for free. iPhone users can buy the book at a discounted price of just Rs 199. You get a 30 days trial for the app on Android. Tap on the button. On the next screen, press Continue to reach the payment page. After entering your payment details, click on Place your order. Once the process is complete, it will show a message saying, "We are setting up your membership." Pressing the cross on the top right corner of the screen will take you back to the book results page. Tap on the book and then tap on Read for free. It will open a new page. Here you can follow the author and then tap on Read Now. It will now open the ebook and you can happily enjoy reading it.